we said a second example of a mashpia and a makabel. Who remembers first of all what it was and then how to explain it? Anybody?
Was it the sea creatures in the ocean?
No, that was my little musings over there. Inside the mimer, he gave another example.
Is it the das?
Yes, let's say the intellect and the emotions. Right. So how does that work? You have intellect and emotions, which, let me just set up the question. Officially, the intellect is in a plane of existence where it's far too high, right, in order to birth out of there directly an emotion, because it's like feeling something and knowing something are in two sections of your being which are so radically distant from each other that really one cannot create another one, right? So how does it work that you actually do create emotions from the mind? Your turn.
So Mamutza would be das. And das has two ways you can lean, chesed and gvura. And so das itself isn't really an emotion. It's not, and also it's like kind of separate from intellect. It's kind of the thing that connects both of them.
You gave the right answer because that's how I explained it. But in the mimer, I was kind of flowering it up a little bit. In the mimer, he basically just says the emotions of the mind. Right, so before you even get to das, it's just basically the midos, the chesed and gevura, that's inside of the mind, right? That it is mind, right? Because it's inside the mind, so it hasn't exited yet in order to become an actual emotion. But the emotions of the mind are not pure mind. That's why I kind of brought in this concept of das. Where do you get even emotions inside the mind? I was trying to explain. So answering somebody's question from the day before, actually, how inside the mind itself, you see that there's the das kind of naturally breaks into a leaning towards chesed and gevura. But the truth is, even in the das, right, I would say that's the emotions in the mind. If it's still in das, then it's actually still mind, because chokhmah, bina, and das are mind. Right? It's just that in the das already there's a leaning towards chesed and gevura. So even when the chesed and gevura come out of the das, and now you have chesed and gevura of mind, now you got full-blown emotions in the mind, right? So you see that's like pregnancy inside of a stage, inside of a stage, inside of a stage. And so now that you've got chesed and gevura of the mind, which is mind still, it's emotions in the mind, but it's in the quality of mind. Now at least there's something to work with where the emotions can relate to something lower than them and actually produce an emotion to come out. The mind itself cannot do it, but the emotions of the mind become the source of the emotions that are outside the mind, right? And that's that intermediary again. So that was a review. Let's go on for today's class. And we're going to take it from, I think, the very bottom 3 lines of that first page I gave you. Well, just actually 4 lines up where it says at the comma, it says kiyadua. There's a footnote 16 there. You see that? So just to cap it off, the final point is shembachinas ha'acharona sheba'elyon. This is the whole point of a mamutza in this one line. The lowest quality of the higher thing of the mashpia na'aseh makor l'tachton. That's what becomes the source of the lower thing. So again, the lowest quality of in this case of the intellect, of the emotions of the intellect. So those emotions of the intellect, they become the source of the lower thing. Now the emotions of the intellect can become the source of the actual emotions. Right? You get that? And that is what's called a mamutza, an intermediary. Now he says, remember, all this was a setup in order to understand this business of the shofar. We started off the conversation with kol v'dibur, voice and speech, which are equally distanced from each other, in the sense that the pure voice, the hevel halev, is in no state to suddenly be broken up into finite letters. They're in 2 different universes. It's too refined of an entity, the pure breath of the heart, to even take this shape that it can be divided up into letters. It doesn't even have a form in any way yet. So that's what we're saying now. Kamokim min midos laosios hadibur. If you're going to go now we went from the mind to the midos, from the midos to the letters of speech, right? So now what are you going to do? You just basically created an emotion in yourself by the intermediary of your mind. Now this emotion is not good. You want to express this emotion to someone. You want to say how you feel. Well, you got a big problem because the letters of speech are like these clumsy little building blocks, and you're sitting there with like this powerful emotive situation inside of you. They don't just go together. So he says, so it is with the midos to the osios, to the letters. Which means come from that pure breath of the heart, which we said is called a kol pashut, which means it's not even really, it doesn't even make sound. It's such a simplified, rarefied type of voice. We're calling it voice, but not the way we normally use voice, which means voice that makes a sound. This is like the pure voice of the heart. Whatever that means. I haven't heard that before because you can't hear it. Right? This speech cannot, your speech mechanism, your 5 constructions of your mouth, it can't take the baton and start running with that because it doesn't pass over. Right? Unless there's some kind of an intermediary in between. And then turning the page, and this is, everyone has the next page, page 716 at the top. This is this expression of the letter Aleph that we were talking about before, which shenishma b'kol zeh, that can be heard with this voice, right? In other words, that's what vowelizes that pure voice of the heart is the letter Aleph, right? It's a letter. But it's not like any other letters. We said it's just kind of like a placeholder to allow it's almost exactly a mashal of the power of growth coming through that seed. If you don't have the spiritual component of that seed, the power of growth just lays dormant, doesn't have anything to attach itself to in order to express itself. So too this sound, right? It's really only able to be vocalized and vowelized because there's this something like the source of all letters, right, which is enabling it to come out. This Aleph is the source of all letters of speech. And it has the whole concept of speech inside of it, because at the end of the day, it is letter-like, and it's almost like it's like the seed, right? It has all the potential of the leaves and the trunk and the fruit and everything inside of this one klal, right? And and while it has all the letters in it in potential, it also is the tamtzis. It's like the final lowest level of the pure voice of the heart. It speaks both languages. Kasher yotze or shefa alev hevel alev lischalik behemotos hapeh acha megaron, etc. And that's the idea that when this pure voice of the heart wants to come out, just like we said regarding the intellect, that the intellect has like a lowest dimension of intellect itself, which was the midos of the intellect. The pure voice of the heart also has the lowest aspect of itself, which is this like potential to make an aleph, right? And therefore, when it wants to come out, it produces that. Now that is in the game, that already has a similar language with all the other letters, because that aleph also happens to be the source of all letters. And so now there's a bridge, this intermediary, and the sound can come out, and the sound can be broken down into pieces called letters. Acha me'agaron just means the letters aleph, ches, hey, and ayin are those 4 letters that are produced from the throat. Those are like called gutturals. Let's get that line. Since the level of the pure voice of the heart, right, which is going to come out of these 5 constructions of the mouth, it's prefaced by investing itself into something which is something which is the flavor of letters, the source of letters, and that is that aleph. Now the sound is in a position to be broken up into little details through the agency of that letter aleph. And it sounds a little bit technical, but it's actually very simple. Once you're making a sound, right, you can turn that sound into all different types of letters. Like if you notice, like when the breath sort of runs out, you got to start over. But like when you're gonna make like a phrase, of speech, or let's say you're playing the trumpet, right? You have to have like a big breath, or the shofar. You have to have a big breath. You can as soon as the breath runs out and you stop like giving that aleph sound to the breath, you obviously are in no position to start chopping it up into different phrases and different syllables and different sounds. But once that sound, that the voice is activated, so as long as that voice is activated, you can use the rest of your mouth construction to chop it up and make syllables and make speech, right? But it has to have this intermediary of being put to sound first, and that is this os aleph, which is the lowest part of the pure breath of the heart.
The heart is I thought the voice is like the beginning, like the highest, like the intellect is to the what's it called, like the idea or whatever. Like
Say it again.
like the idea is like speaking, like having the idea come into like formation, and intellect is like it's above, it's so high that it's hard.
Right. So let me put it into place for you. Right. You have the intellect, the midos of the intellect, and then the midos.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that parallels. You have the pure voice of the heart, the aleph, and then the words.
But you need. How do you?
You understand how that goes together?
Yeah, I get it. But
Okay.
Words. You're saying how? Is there an intermediary for them to form? Like, what's the thing that actually makes them? Like
The 5 constructions of the mouth basically makes them formed. It's like a mechanical thing
yeah.
where you're just chopping up the sound. But unless you have sound coming out, you can't chop it up.
Yeah.
So that's called the intermediary. It's like this sound, right? Which itself is not a given. That sound's going to come out. The heart doesn't make sound. Only the lowest part of the heart, which is the aleph, makes sound. Now that you have this, that's the intermediary. Now that you have the sound coming up, you can chop up the sound and put it into particular pieces. Just like the power of growth is going to go into a trunk and branches and leaves and fruits, right? So that's like chopping it up. Once you've got your basic, components of like identity of the tree, because you've taken the pure power of the ground, which could be anything, and you funneled it now into like it's a channel, which is an apple tree, right? Now now the details of the apple tree can come out. So too with the voice. Now, this aleph can be heard. It brings to sound the simple voice of the heart, and then now can be divided up into parts. He says, for example, let's say he breaks it down even further. Let's say you want to say the word vayomer. Let me give this to Aryeh. Sheyesh bo hey osios mechulakim mekama motzas mechulakim. What is the vayomer? Right? It has 5 different letters, and these 5 different letters, each one of them comes from different constructions of the mouth. Right? There's 5 different parts of the mouth that each one makes 4 different types of letters approximately, and this word vayomer has a bunch of them, right? From different aspects of the mouth. Ha'alef min motze hagaron. The aleph comes from the throat. The vav and the mem come from the lips. That's sfasayim, right? What's that? Yeah, the vav and the mem, right? They come from the lips. The boomf, right? Which is basically those 4 letters, base, vav, mem, and pei. They are the 4 that come mi'asfasayim, from the lips, right? And then you have the reish, minashinayim kiyadua. There's a whole other world over there called the reish, which comes from the teeth, right? Reish, that's how you make a reish, from your teeth have to get involved. So he says, Vehini, so you have this word vayomer, it's actually a whole science project going on in your mouth, right? He says, Vehine, Bekol HaPashut, Betchilas Mitziyasu, Mehevel Alev, Mischalek Begim Motzos Halalu. So this is from the pure voice, right? Which is found in the breath of the heart. In order to get divided into these 3 mouth configurations, Garon, Bashinayim, Basfasayim, which is the throat, the teeth, and the lips. Bishvil avaras teva zu de vayomer, in order to actually express this word vayomer, lo yatsa mehevel alev rak kol aleph pashut ba'os aleph kanal. So what we're saying is, to make it very simple, he repeats himself kind of a lot in this mimer, but just for our benefit, is that what the first thing that happens is, you don't just start jumping in with teeth and throat and whatever and lips. The hevel alev, the breath of the heart, it just makes one. It only knows how to make one sound, right? It makes the aleph. That's the only thing it can do. Just like the mind cannot just produce emotions. It's not going to happen. It doesn't know how to produce emotions. At best, it can produce the emotions of mind. It could just like basically hatch its own lowest part. So too, the breath of the heart. It can't make words. It could just, at very best, it can make its own lowest part, which is its own expression of the pure sound, which comes out as an aleph. And then once you have the aleph, that can be divided by the lips and the mouth and the throat. In order to bring out these actually divided letters. Os aleph min hagaron, vav resh min hashinayim vasvasayim. And then the other ones from the teeth and the lips. V'nimtza agde os aleph hanishma ba'avar is kol hapashut. So it comes out that through this letter aleph, which can be heard, right, as an expression of the simple voice, that's like just the sound is basically your kol pashut, your simple voice of the heart, having its version of expression. Terembo behemotzos. Before it comes to the delineation of the 5 parts of the mouth, nimshach hakol yischalek b'tevos vayomer. Only then can it then is it in a position to be broken down into the word vayomer. And why is that? Because this voice of that's powering the os aleph, which is going to be drawn into the word vayomer, hu b'chinas mamutza. That aleph is a mamutza. So the kol pashut of the aleph is the final level, the lowest level of the essential breath of the heart itself. And simultaneous that os aleph, it has all the other letters inside it in potential, because it is a letter. It's like the king of all letters, right? And from the reason that we said before, v'dai l'mevi, and that should be sufficient for the wise. Are you guys wise? Is that sufficient? Understand? Okay, let's go on. This gets a little bit complicated now.
Just wanting to confirm.
Yeah.
The potential for the sound to be generated.
Yeah.
Before it gets broken down into actual sounds.
Actual letters.
Actual letters.
Right.
To make words and sounds.
Right.
That's the mamutza. That's.
Yeah, the fact that it can come in an audible. In fact, it can be audible, right? Is the mamutza. Because the pure breath of the heart is not audible.
Yeah.
But it contains inside of it the ability to be audible.
Which is like one step in, one step out.
Right. Right. Like the lowest part of the breath of the heart is that it can make sound. That's it. It can't make words, but it can make sound. But once it makes sound, that sound itself, that aleph, it has in potential all the letters inside of it, because it's a mamutza. It's half breath of the heart and it's half letters. And therefore, it carries the breath of the heart to make letters.
Okay.
Now it gets a little bit more interesting. He says, "Kamo king mamish yuvan gankim osios machshava." What we spoke about now is the actual letters of speech, but there's something very subtle inside of the human being which we don't think about its construction very much, which is the letters of thought. You actually think in letters, right? Obviously, but it's not so obvious. You don't realize that letters are flying through your head all the time, right? And so he says, and letters of thought, they also have to have an intermediary in order to enable them to come to be. He says, just like the emotions are in no comparison and not of the essence of intellect at all, right? The midos and the intellect are completely distinct in their levels. To the point that if you want to have emotions coming out from intellect, the only way to do it is through the intermediary of the emotions of the intellect, as we've been saying. So too, the letters of thought are incomparably lower than your essential spiritual power to think. Right? So it's the same thing, like just even producing letters of thought, which is basically speaking to yourself, basically, not with your mouth, but with your mind, right? Conjuring up letters. How do you even get to the point that these clumsy letters show up on the screen of your mind from the pure power of your intellect? Those are two completely incomparable levels of your soul. Just like speech letters are completely incomparable to the pure voice of the emotions, like the unheard voice of the emotions, so too your thought letters are completely incomparable to your power, the pure power of your intellect. Right? And yet, it's clear as day that the letters of your thought are coming from your mind, from your intellectual powers. You're not just like randomly thinking letters that are not based on your concentrated meditations. Just like it's obvious that your speech is coming out of your mouth, which is basically produced from somewhere inside there. It's telling you it's from the breath of the heart, right? So it's happening, even though they're two incomparable levels. Somehow one is producing the other. How does it take place? Right, and like you can see, like letters are mamash incomparable to emotions. He's saying, guess what? Your thoughts are incomparable to your intellect. How do they produce them? Raksh is kol the osios, right? Machshava nikra kala penima debina. Okay, so here we're going deeper in here. So he says the voice of the letters of thought. Obviously, this is not a regular type of voice. You see, he's using the word kol as sort of just like something which brings it like a hamshacha that brings something from one place to another, right? So the voice of your letters of thought are called kala panima de bina. They're called the inner voice of bina, right? So bina is an aspect of your intellect, of course, and what we're saying is that just like your heart, right, has like this secret ability to express itself called the kol, but the kol doesn't come out on its own without an intermediary. So too your brain has an ability to express itself, to come out, and that's called its voice, right? It doesn't get vocalized in an audible way, but something's coming out, and it is in a certain sense audible to your own mind. And this coming, just like we had the letters come from the midos, the letters of thought come from bina, and it's called kala penima de lo mishtama. It's a secret voice that is not heard. As it says elsewhere. And therefore, how's it going to come out of your bina without a mamutza? How's it going to actually come up and be, so to speak, heard in letters without some type of intermediary? Al derech hanal b'kol hevel alev v'dibur, just like we said before regarding the voice of the heart in coming out in speech. De os aleph de kol, it has to come out through the aleph. Kach yuva ba'osios machshava gamkin. So it is in this higher dimension of letters of thought. Just like we went through just now a conversation about how you're going to express the word vayomer in speech, that we said what you have to start off with the letter aleph, making a sound, and then break it up through the tongue, the teeth and the lips and the throat. After it's already like carrying the sound of the aleph, kach tevas vayomer. Zeh kamoshu machshava. So too it is the word vayomer. If you want to just think, everyone just think to yourself for a second. The word vayomer. Go ahead and do it. Right? You hear it. Right? I can't hear it, but you can hear it. What's going on there? You're like producing letters inside of your brain. It's a very strange thing. And he said, in order for that to happen, don't take it for granted. Your like pure power of your intellect is actually not able to do that on its own. It needs a mamutza.
So what is a mamutza again?
It's an intermediary.
So it needs so this intermediary will be like making the like sound like happen in the head.
Not necessarily the sound. First of all, but you're saying sound. I know what you mean, right? But no, the oh yeah. See, the mutza makes the sound. Yes, that's right. The mutza sort of makes it like the pure intellect available to be expressed in some type of sound, right? That sound can then be broken up into letters that you hear in your mind. It's a little bit different. You're gonna see when it comes to the mind as it is in the heart. The analogy is not perfect, But he says, "Kishachoshev tziruf tevazo de vayomer." When you're going to be thinking the letter combinations of this word vayomer, behechrich sheyavo sibas haosios machshav mechulakos haele mibechinas or hasechol. It must be right that sheyavo sibas osios, that the cause of these letters of thought, right, which are divided up, are coming from the light of your intellect, shemislavish b'tevazu, that is encloaking itself into these words. It has to come through a mamutza. If it's happening, you're hearing the word vayomer. In other words, it must be that the light of your intellect is going there through an intermediary. And what is this intermediary? Just like the aleph, right? We said that it's of the letters, but it's the source of all the letters, right? The aleph, like, is a type of letter which is like the king of all letters, and that's what makes it the ability to be the intermediary, because it has all the letters inside of it. So too in thought, right? There must be some intermediary letter of thought which is letters, but it's the source of all the letters. And just like every intermediary, it must be that it's the end part, the bottom part, the lowest level of intellect. Just like we said regarding the seed, that like the spiritual power of growth inside the seed is the lowest part of the power of growth in the earth. Or just like we said regarding the emotions of the mind, the lowest part of the mind, right? Or like we said about the aleph, that it's the lowest part of the breath of the heart. So too, the intellect must have its lowest part, right? And that's going to be the intermediary. That's going to be the source of all the letters. The lowest part of the higher one is the source of the lower one, as we've been saying this whole time. And through that intermediary stage, not pure intellect and not the actual letters popping up in your mind, through that intermediary stage, that's how you're going to wind up, so to speak, quote unquote, hearing those letters in your mind. Has to cross through that lowest part of the intellect. By Inyanhu, and the idea is, but there's no aleph in this particular case. The aleph is what we're talking about in sound of words that you say with your mouth, right? But the concept of the aleph, right, is that there's something aleph-like, which is an intermediary, which is the lowest part of the intellect, and yet contains all of the letters of thought also. By Inyan hu ki yadua, and it's known, shaseichel yesh bo gam kim bechinas osios. As it turns out, the intellect itself has like hidden letters in it. It's just that they're in a state of total concealment. He says they're very, very, very refined, and they're included inside of your spiritual intellectual powers. So what he's saying here is, by the way, slightly different, as he's going to say in the parentheses, and I'll jump onto that now. What he's saying here is different than what we said before about the heart, and in order to know the distinction, to make it, each of them easier to understand. Before we did not say that the breath of the heart had hidden letters in it, right? We never said that. We said it has no letters in it whatsoever, and all it has is like one letter aleph, right? It doesn't have a bunch of letters, the breath of the heart. It just has the ability to produce a sound, which is what we're calling an aleph. But that aleph, now, since it's already a construct of your mouth, it can break down into many, many different letters. But now we're saying something slightly different when it comes to the mind and how it produces letters of thought. We're saying that all the letters are actually contained inside the mind. Unlike the breath of the heart, which does not contain any letters but one aleph, the mind, the spiritual quality of like your chokhmah and bina, they actually contain 22 letters in them, unlike the breath of the heart. It's just that those letters at that status, they are in a state of helem and dakus me'od, right? They're extremely, extremely concealed and refined. The best way I could come to think of an analogy for this is like we use sometimes the analogy of the kum, right? You have this hot water urn, and what's the analogy we always use is that if you burn it down, someone was actually nervous about it. It you see like there's limestone when you burn all the water away, right? And it's like filled with stones all of a sudden. It's crazy. So when you clean all those stones out, you fill it up again, heat it up, the water goes out, stones again. Did someone put stones in there? No. Where did the stones come from? Where do those stones come
What do
from?
you mean in the water in Israel? It's not in everywhere.
It's a lot of places.
Not in Australia.
Where did the stones come from?
Potential in the water.
What's that?
Potential in the water.
They're in the water,
In the water.
right? They're mamish in the water. There's stones in the water. It's just there is. It's not a joke. There's like the minerals, whatever you want to call it. There's stones in the water. When you remove all the water, when you remove the water, you reveal the stones. But the stones that are in the water, they're at they're called water. You don't pick up stones and start grinding stones with that water. The stones, when they're in the water boiled up, they're not called stones, they're called water. But they're definitely in there. What's the proof? Get rid of the water, you're gonna see the stones. So this is the level, what's called the letters of thought inside of the intellect, right? The intellect is not, right, your pure intellect is not a verbal experience. And this is the second preface I'm going to give. First preface is the kumkum. The second thing that must be understood in order to understand what we're saying here is the difference between seichel and machshava. Does anyone want to give it a go? Maybe Yisrael. What's the difference between seichel and machshava? Intellect and thought.
Thought is
Produces it.
Yeah.
maybe
Sorry, Israel. Persian. Everyone has to go first. What's that?
Machshava is a garment.
Machshava is a garment. Okay.
Seichel
Is
is
a garment.
part of the chachma.
Right. Seichel is part of the soul. It's basically part of the soul. So when you're talking about garments versus the 10 soul powers, right? We know there's 10 soul powers from Chochmah to Malchus, and then there's the garments of the soul. The garments of the soul are not soul powers. They're merely garbing the soul. So they're infinitely lower, right?
Garment levush.
Lavush. Just compared to your body, right? Literally, it's different. But they're called garments for a reason. Can you compare in any way whatsoever, any shape, form, whatever? What's the word I'm looking for? Can you compare in any form whatsoever your body, even like the smallest part of your body, your fingernails, to your clothes? I mean, one is like slapped on some like separate, disconnected reality, and one is you. So too, when it comes to your soul powers. So machshava, even though people tend to think that they are their thoughts, and that like this is some kind of like a very significant part of you, it's not. It's like some extended thing that's simply attached to you, right? And the reality is, even compared to emotions, right? Letters and speech, we got through saying, is really something that like is a completely incomparable level. So when you're having an emotion, it is not a verbal linguistic experience, is it? Right? You're feeling something. So and sometimes we say even that you're feeling something so much that you can't speak. Right? When the emotion grips you in the full power of your emotion, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but you can't say anything. Right? It happens, right? Either from joy or chas v'shalom from the opposite. You just can't say a word. That's why actually, we give the first meal that we serve to a person who's mourning is an egg, right? Because it's supposed to be like represent like a closed mouth. You're just like nothing to talk about here, right? You can't talk at that point because the emotion is so strong. As we've been saying, the emotion has to filter down into its lowest level, the intermediary. Only then it can express itself into actual words. So if the emotions already are non-verbal and are a like soul experience, vibrant experience that can only best be like defined by being emotional, right? Then that which is above the emotions in the soul, which is your chokhmah, bina, and das, that's definitely not verbal. You see, the reason I use this as an analogy, you have to understand first emotions to even understand what it means to have an intellectual experience. Most people equate intellectual experiences with words going on, right? Language. And that's why I wanted to make the distinction between machshava and seichel. Machshava, thought, is when there's language coming out. Seichel, just like emotions do not implicitly have language, it's an experience, so too intellect is an experience, and it's even a higher, more lofty experience than emotion itself. So what does it look like? It's like your cognitive abilities, which are it's just an experience you're having of like figuring something out, but it's not like with words, right? It's something much deeper. It's like almost like if you're going to do a math problem, and maybe you can sort of tap into that a little bit, like the way your logic works. It does not have to do with, the fact that there is words describing that. It's just like emotions. You could describe your emotions with words, but you've already gone far away from the actual experiencing of the emotion itself. So too, you could describe your intellect with words, but believe it or not, you've gone very far from actually having the intellectual experience itself. This requires explanation, because most people can't even, sort that out. That's why I always use the analogy of emotions first, because that you can sort of relate to. I'm having an emotion. It's not linguistic, right? Intellect is the same. Now going back to the two analogies together with the kumkum and understanding what seichel is, right? The seichel is not a verbal experience, but there are letters inside there. Just like there's letters inside of your emotion, theoretically, right? It's just that it has to go through an intermediary to come out. So too, there's 22 letters inside of your raw intellectual experience, but they're in such a refined level that they're really not there at all. And that's why they're like the stones inside the water. They're in a state of bittul metzias, but they're there. And so if you would actually say what's the lowest level of my intellect, I would say it's the letters inside of my intellect. The stones inside the water, it's not the water. It's the stones of the water, which is the lowest level of the water, but it's still wet, right? It's still a liquid. It's just that inside of there, that it contains the power to be a stone. That's called the intermediary, so to speak, of the mind, right? It's not even the intermediary yet. It's just that there's a potential for the intermediary to get its hands on those letters. Let's see inside a little bit more about that. Does everyone follow more or less that whole concept? Yeah. Question?
It made sense when, like you said, when you talk about the emotions with the lowest part of the intellect then becoming the potential for
Wait, the emotions or intellect?
for emotions.
Okay.
That made sense. What's the intermediary for the mind? Is it the potential for those
for the mind?
Yeah, for those thoughts, already, you said the letters are already in the mind. So
Right.
What's
But that's what I was kind of just I also got lost on that point. But my assumption, what he's about to say, is that the letters of the mind themselves are the intermediary for the actual letters that you hear in your as machshava. So you have seichel and machshava, which is basically like your mashpia and your makabel. And what's the intermediary is the letters inside the seichel, right? But with that, we're going to have to pick it up tomorrow, Bezrat Hashem. It is. Yeah, Baruch Hashem. How you holding up, man?